So it's a real pleasure to be here, and particularly to share a table with Ugo, given his extensive work in Chile on mining and other environmental conflicts. In some ways, my title, Mining and Environmental Conflicts, I'm not the best person to speak on this. Let me explain why. There's an extensive amount of work from members of ENTITLE already on environmental conflicts. I'm thinking in particular, of course, of the long record of work of Joanne, and in particular of a recent report through the ENTITLE project, a report coordinated by Begum and Beatrice on mining and environmental conflicts around the world, which creates a map and an account of 25 different mining and energy related conflicts, and works systematically through these to identify commonalities, differences. So there's a tremendous, rich record of work on environmental conflicts around mining and energy within the ENTITLE network. So given that, I thought fairly long and hard about what I could do today that would add value to those conversations. I'm not sure that I'll succeed, but I will try. So for those of you who were at the February workshop in Manchester, which as you'll know was about theories in political ecology, the topic that I was talking about there was about theories of extraction. And this is a slide from that presentation. And some of the basic distinctions we laid out in the course of that discussion was between primary sector activities of extraction and the secondary sector of manufacturing. Distinctions between industrial production as a form of economic activity and those of raw material acquisition. And we then laid also out some distinctions within the primary sector between agriculture and extraction, and looked at the work on political economies of agrarian change, for example, to see how political ecologists and others had theorized of those relationships. And then from that, this third level at the bottom, we talked about specific theories of extraction around exchange, production, and speculation. And my conclusion from that discussion was the following: that really the resource extraction then is a mode of production that's based on the capture and appropriation of an ecological surplus, an appropriation, if you like, of time and space, where the conditions of production that produce these raw materials precede human labour. And that whilst extraction as a regime precedes capitalism and exists in non-capitalist forms, for our purposes, extraction under capitalism is based on the appropriation of ecological surpluses for the purposes of accumulation. And we talked then about specific ways in which one could think about both production of commodities for exchange, classic commodities production, but also other ways for circulating capital in multiple forms, and particularly processes of investment and speculation. And the final point we made from that was that the environmental conditions, time, space, and form, using the holy trinity of Scott Prudden and others, that these strongly shape extractive institutions. So the reason I've laid that out today, and recapping if you like, is because some of what I'm going to say about the nature of environmental conflicts relates to that particular understanding of what extraction is. So here's what I thought I could usefully do today. 3 things: why, what, and where. There's some other question words in there that we could talk about. Whether, who, when. But we're not going to do that. We're going to stick with why. Why focus on conflict? Why do we do that? What are we trying to achieve by doing it? And what I'm going to do there is try and reflect on some of the discussions we've had collectively over the last few days. And what do we talk about when we talk about conflict? What are we trying to get at? And then, more critically perhaps, think about where we place or cite conflict. When we talk about conflict, where do we place it geographically? To what places, spaces, scales do we attribute conflict? And in working through this why, what, and where, I'm going to do it by reference to a specific case. In some ways it's not the most interesting case, but I do think it's a very illustrative case, and it's very current, and it's something I know a little bit about, which is the case of shale gas development, fracking, as it relates to the northwest of the UK. Close to home in that respect. Okay, so the question of why. Well, the first, why focus on conflict? The first observation would simply be that we shouldn't be surprised that conflicts occur. They're ubiquitous, they're inevitable, they're the normal state of being. And a lot of political ecology would identify the roots of these inequalities that create conflicts as emerging from the organisation of economies along capitalist principles. Not all political ecology would make that argument, but a lot of it would. And then it's nuanced by the way that those inequalities intersect with other axes of differentiation, around race, around ethnicity, around gender. So what we share within ENTITLE, and the film nicely illustrated this, the thing we share is this emphasis and understanding of society as being structured, as being stratified. And the key questions are the reproduction of inequalities. And that initiatives to extract resources or to improve urban air quality are ultimately political projects, meaning that they emerge from and tend to reproduce existing social relationships of power. So far, so basic. But I think we can also go a little bit further and say, well, why are our interest in conflict and this differentiated character of society emerges in part because of the roots of political ecology as being a rejection, a critique of neo-Malthusian arguments about the relationship between nature and society. Political ecology, of course, turns the lens back onto society to say, how is it that societies are organised? It is through their organisation that issues of scarcity or soil degradation or pollution emerge, rather than some confrontation with external limits. So that then is what I think we share as a group. But having said that, I think that there are some significant differences in how we interpret conflict. For some of us working out of a particular tradition, conflict is a structural condition. It's inherent. For some others of us working out of other traditions, what matters most about conflict is moments of politicisation. So we see conflicts when things get politicised. For others, first group, conflicts are there. And the key question from that perspective is, why don't those structural contradictions, structural conflicts, emerge in politicisation more often? So if you like, methodologically, this is a very interesting difference. Because out of that first perspective, the thing to problematise is, why does conflict not occur more often? How do, given these contradictions in socio-natural relationships, given that, why doesn't conflict erupt, politicisation erupt more frequently? So this is one distinction, then, I think, between seeing conflicts as being pervasive but often latent and not expressed, and another view which sees conflict as expressions. So we might then say that if we take two economies, take an economy like Nigeria, take an economy like Norway, this example was introduced the other day. Both of these are petro-states. Both of them share a set of contradictory conflictual relationships around the extraction of oil and other fossil fuels. Around, for example, the access that owners of capital have to state resources. The landowner versus the investor relationship. That's common across these two jurisdictions. They also share a conflictual relationship around the distribution of profit between investing firms and workers. Classic labour relation. They also share the same conflictual relationship around the distributions of rent. And the relationship between present generations and future generations around the distribution of waste. These are the common conflictual arrangements around petro-extractive states. But of course, the key thing is that in these two places, those are expressed quite differently, expressed politically in different ways. There's a lot one could say about this, I'm not going to, but in very simplified terms, we could say that one of the axes of politicisation in Norway is around exclusion in time, which is to do with who will receive the benefits from Norway's oil wealth over time. So it's about the rate of extraction. That's one of the political dynamics of environmental and social organising in Norway around oil wealth. Whereas in Nigeria, one of the axes of differentiation that's quite important is exclusion in the current time. The phenomenon of tremendous oil wealth, grinding poverty, the issues of oil theft, the forced acquisition of access to oil through the theft of oil from pipelines and tankers, for example. So the other thing we might say here then around why focus on conflict is that actually underlying this then there are a whole range of different processes, and that perhaps focusing on conflict underspecifies. It doesn't perhaps, be my provocation, give us a clear enough view of what those key processes are. So one way of thinking about this in very practical terms, in terms of commonalities amongst fellows research, whilst we're all dealing in conflicts in some form or another, it may be that cross-cutting connections are around processes of commodification, for example, processes of rent extraction. So it may be that these processes are ways of thinking about commonalities as opposed to boxing them all up as conflicts. And then, of course, the other key question behind this, and it's something for us to all think about, I think, is what's the purpose of research and knowledge generation, what we're doing here in the context of existing conflicts. Which brings me to my second question, the what question. What do we talk about when we talk about conflict? And here is a very undynamic map. This doesn't show convergence, it doesn't show divergence, it doesn't show priorities. It's simply an effort to think about the range of ways in which we have been, over the last few days, mobilising conflict in our work, what we're trying to do when we talk about conflict. So for some of us, it's about documenting, it's about bearing witness, about illustrating inequalities, a demonstration. So I was just thinking of Ugo's illustration there of the patterns of transhumance and the way that that changed after the acquisition of water. A very vivid illustration of the forms of change that are created by these mining activities around water use. And in some ways, this is very similar to that first generation of feminist research within geography. It often styles itself as empirical feminism. It was about documenting inequalities, about the way women were excluded from labour markets through provisions for transportation and through norms about gender divisions of labour. But fundamentally, it was an empirical project about demonstrating, bearing witness, and showing through data. This point about taking sides and win, and to win. I mean this quite specifically, but the idea here is about an instrumental use of knowledge. That for some of us, we recognise we're involved in struggles, battles, and the object of being in a battle is to win. And what that means is mobilising ideas in perhaps quite a strategic way. So the idea that's out there of strategic essentialism. We may invoke forms of nature, for example, forms of indigeneity, because we know they will be politically effective. They enable us to do things. For some of us, it's about historicising struggle, understanding the origins of conflicts, their deeply rooted nature, their sedimentation and their reproduction over time, around labour, around the origins of environmental conflicts, for example. I'm not going to go through all of these. This green one on the right, of course, is about not just demonstrating and empirically verifying and bearing witness, but about working with new ideas that are emerging out of particular areas of conflict, particular sites. To recognise there are new ways of thinking, new ways of doing, new ways of framing, and specific forms of environmental knowledge that can be mobilised. And the bottom one here is this incomplete, in the sense that I'm not attempting to be comprehensive. I'm sure there are other things out there. Okay. So now I'm going to focus on energy and mining. So the first thing to say is we're trying to characterise conflicts over energy and mining. The first thing that obviously springs to mind is this is a highly heterogeneous group. Energy, a classic 19th century term, which was developed in order to commensurate radically different things. to enable one to compare coal extracted from the Lancashire coalfields and wood from the hillsides of central Britain, so that their calorific values could be understood and put into boilers of machines. So energy, as itself, covers a whole range of radically different material entities. For example, gas, hydropower, biomass. We can think about how the materialities of those exert significant influences on the nature of conflicts. And going beyond those sort of biophysical characteristics, we can think about the forms of social organisation. Mining exists in a whole range of forms. Two extremes, we've got so-called artisanal, small-scale mining, often referred to as informal, sometimes placed legally as illegal mining. And on the other, we've got the large corporate forms that we are familiar with, Rio Tinto being one classic example. Of course, we've got state mining firms as well. So to try and come up with statements about energy and mining conflicts generically is perhaps the wrong thing to try to do. But I do think there are some things distinctive that are common across these range of materials. And the first would be this point about what these conflicts ultimately are mobilised around. The way they take form, their initiating point, is the effort to appropriate, to capture and to transfer, socially and spatially, through trade, an ecological service, to take and to use by one group. So it's this appropriation and transfer. And the second element is around this distribution of environmental burdens. Of course, it's been well documented through Joanne's work and other people too, on the way in which these processes of extracting and processing raw materials are metabolic processes. They involve segregating, for example, the valuable part from the waste, distributing waste materials, distributing the valuable component too. And that those processes are metabolic in a whole range of ways, both technical, we think about the technologies of extraction, but they're also about remetabolizing those materials, perhaps in the bodies of fish, which then become bioaccumulated in the bodies of humans. I'm sorry. It sounds quite loud here, but this is the sea. I'm always reluctant to yield to the sea. Okay, so what I thought I'd do now is try and anchor this a little bit by talking about one, Stefania, is this better? Try and anchor it by talking about one specific case to do with shale gas fracking, hydraulic fracturing, which, as many people know, involves taking solid blocks of rock, applying pressure and liquids to it in order to liberate gas that's trapped within it, and therefore extract gas from materials in which it was formerly trapped. And the point I'm trying to raise here is, well, let me just explain what this is, and then I'll problematise it by saying what actually is this, what do we want to call this. What this is, in engineering terms, is a drill rig. And this is doing exploratory drilling, one of two wells that have been drilled northwest of Manchester, in parts of West Lancashire, to explore for shale gas. It's run by a company called Quadrilla Resources, and the recent estimations of the size of gas reserves are very large indeed. There's no production at the current time. The initial drilling created some seismic shocks, which is probably not surprising, but they were on a scale around 3.5 on the Richter scale, that they caused some alarm, that led to a moratorium, and recently the moratorium has been lifted and a decision to go ahead with shale gas drilling in the UK. The scale of shale gas drilling in the UK is very small indeed, compared to North America, where of course it's revolutionised gas availability, created large-scale problems around groundwater contamination, has significantly reduced the US's emissions of carbon dioxide because of gas has largely replaced coal in power generation. Although it's had the opposite effect in the UK because coal, which is now very cheap in the US, is being imported into the UK and burned in UK power stations. So the UK's emissions of CO2 have gone up as a consequence of shale gas in the United States. So my point here in saying what is this is to think about the ways conflict is emerging around this particular event, an intervention in the natural an intervention in the biophysical world in order to extract a resource. One of the dynamics of conflict. Well, quite straightforwardly, for some people this is a concern about groundwater. Mobilised in particular by Josh Fox's film, Gasland, concerns about the effect of drilling in aquifers to extract gas. For other people, this is an earthquake hazard, and this has implications for property values. For others, this is about not the gas that's taken out under controlled conditions, but you're fracking something. You're liberating gas into the environment in an uncontrolled way. It's methane, which has a higher global warming potential than CO2, and so there's concern there about the external effects of capturing gas in the form of methane release. For other people, it's about the loss of prime farmland. For other people, it's about nuisance as a legal term, describing noise and traffic. And for other people, it's about the transfer of costs to local government, provision of roads, provision of services. But a number of groups are going beyond that to say, actually what's occurring here through fossil fuel extraction is a form of fossil fuel lock-in. That whilst gas may be seen as some form of transitional fuel, actually what we're doing is further embedding fossil fuels in our energy mix. Other people critique it for being an inefficient, a massively inefficient jobs creation machine. Given the amount of money that's spent on this, the number of jobs created is very low. Other people say, look, what's going on here is actually a form of speculative accumulation. Look who the winners are as Quadrilla's share price rises on announcements of new farms. And when Centrica, one of the utility companies, decides to buy into Quadrilla resources, share prices rise dramatically. For other people, this is not about fracking. This is about the capture of energy policy by vested interests. For other people, this is about the long-term reproduction of unequal relationships in the UK and the way in which its northwest Lancashire, relatively socioeconomic indicators are lower than for other parts of the UK, that it's that area that's been the site of fracking as opposed to Sussex, where there are similar operations proposed. For other people, this is in energetic terms, in ecological economics terms, this is a form of energetic madness. You know, the actual energy return on investment for shale gas is quite high if you measure it at the well. But if you measure it at what they call the city gate, once it's actually delivered, after all the compression processes and the shipment in pipelines, the energy return on investment is very low. And other people critique it for just singularly being flat out a failure of imagination. That this is buying into the continued idea of supply as a solution to energy problems. So I need to close. So let me then turn to the point about where. I think a lot of work in political ecology on mining and energy conflicts situates the site of conflict at the extractive frontier. And that emerges particularly in work, for example, on social metabolism, where demand, the sucking of natural material and its incorporation into industrial processes, is effectively driving a scouring process, a race for what's left, a search to the ends of the earth for sites of raw materials. So that as a result, it's in the periphery where these struggles over resource access occurs. Now that argument is nuanced in lots of interesting ways, about significant shifts in the location of demand, the rise of China, the rise of India. We could talk a bit more about that perhaps in the discussion. But principally what the effect of this analysis of conflicts does is it establishes conflict as being one of the defence of community, the defence of places that are besieged by raw material acquisition practices. And this becomes a defence of place. And what's interesting, I think, is that there are emerging from some of the environmental justice organisations alternative ways of understanding the communities that fall around extractive projects, that transcend place. They're not about the mobilisation of location, of tradition, or of rootedness in place, but they're about establishing communities, for example, along the commodity chain. So in the UK case, one of the most interesting coalitions around fracking has been with people who are protesting the new generation of gas-fired turbines that are being introduced in the UK for the power sector, to connect these massive investments in power generation for gas with arguments about localising supply through fracking gas in the UK. to argue that these are processes of embedding a fossil fuel system. There are other notions of ecological citizenship, for example, that transcend layers. So my point here would be that out of some of the work of environmental justice organisations are emerging alternatives to this understanding of conflicts as being rooted in particular locations. My final provocation here would be, are there consequences from seeing conflict as deriving from throughput, from social metabolism? As being effectively a race for what's left, as being ultimately driven by demand. And my point here would be that what's ultimately driving these extractive projects is not demand, disembodied demand. It is the opportunities, the commercial opportunities, the returns that are available through energy and mining projects for capital. Capital is able to seek out energy and mining projects as a place in which to expand itself. And the point about that is that it's possible to think of ways in which alternative places in which that capital could be invested to expand itself. And in the context of the UK, there's a very sharp disjuncture between the failure to invest in demand reduction through efficiency gains, for example, compared to the willingness to invest in new forms of energy supply. So my point here would be to think about the way that conflicts emerge not from social metabolism and forms of demand, but instead the way they emerge from logics of investment and capital circulation. And ultimately then what conflict is, in the terms that I've tried to see it, would be not over from where demand will be satisfied, but over the social control of investment, over how we get to determine where investment takes place, in what forms of projects. So for example, to narrow it back down to the case of the UK, one could see the issue of fracking as actually being a failure to invest long term in the quality of the housing stock in the UK. Poor thermal insulation capacities of that housing stock has a lot to do with the demand for gas in the UK. And it's into that space that Quadrilla and other investing companies are seeing an opportunity to circulate their capital and expand it through potentially new gas deposits. So my time's up, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.